My name is Phil Dalton. I'm the director of Hofstra's Center for Civic Engagement. I am also a professor of Rhetoric and Public Advocacy. As an introduction to today's events, this day of dialogue, the Center for Civic Engagement is an institution that is the culmination of a couple of people's visions, specifically those of Dr. Cynthia Bogard, who has retired, and Dr. Greg Maney, who passed away in 2017. And both of these individuals championed community engagement through both talk and action. And consequently, our mission includes the objective of fostering student awareness of local, national, and global issues, and encouraging students to be active citizens and contributors to their local, national, and global communities. Over 20 members of the faculty and administration comprise the very active board that recognizes how crucial our mission is to helping ensure our society is seated with educated people who have the tools and agency to engage their communities and advocate for fairness and social justice. We're very lucky as a center here to also be aided by 16 undergraduate fellows who are among Hofstra's brightest and most driven students. I'm told that our first day of dialogue, a vision of Dr. Bogard's, was nearly 20 years ago. And today, this day remains a centerpiece of our center's programming. And the goal of this day is shared with our center's community deliberative dialogue efforts, our Institute for Peace Studies, and our minor in Peace and Conflict Studies. And at its core, this day is as much about speaking as it is about hearing, listening, and contemplating. As someone trained in communication studies, I've seen in my years of teaching that many, many people are prepared and equipped to speak their minds, but too few possess the skills to stop and consider the legitimacy of what others have to say, to consider the possibility that they themselves may be wrong, or that they share common ground. And today it seems we're all speaking, or texting, or Instagramming, or TikToking, and yet for all our volume and expressive savvy, it doesn't seem like we've arrived at a much better place. So it gives me great pleasure this morning to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Marianne Trasciatti. Dr. Trasciatti is a professor of rhetoric and public advocacy and is also the director of labor studies here at Hofstra. The event she's moderating this morning is titled Social Media, Public Persuasion, and Social Change, and it captures what the Day of Dialogue is about. As you'll see, it puts students front and center in the discussion. So now, to avoid spoiling anything, I'd like to introduce Dr. Trasciatti.
Thank you, Phil Dalton. And can we give Phil Dalton a round of applause? Because he works like a dog for the CCE and deserves, I think, as the director of labor studies, I think it's fair that I recognize people's work. Also, the Cultural Center representatives, and I mean, these are the people who keep all these events going. Carol and Athleen in particular, Athleen Collins and Carol Mallison, this campus is so much richer because of the work that they do. And so I think we should give them a round of applause and express our deep gratitude. Okay, so I'm gonna call my students up. So I teach persuasion this semester, and it's a really great semester to be teaching persuasion. Because we're talking about we're in this logjam. There are lots of things that people want to change, and we just don't seem to be able to move things forward in the way that we would like to. And so there's been a lot of talk recently around everything from vaccines to police reform. And, we really need to persuade people to get on board for the things that need to change in the ways that we'd like to see them change. And that's what we talk about in class. And it's a great group of students. They're all terrific, as I say to them almost on a daily basis, like, I can't believe they pay me to do this. We have these really great discussions. And so they have hammered out some things that they'd like to talk about today with you. So this is a student-focused panel. So if there are faculty colleagues here and you want to say things, I'm going to ask you in advance you're welcome to say them, but please defer to the students first, because we'd really like to give our students an opportunity to share their ideas with you and with one another. So I'm going to introduce the students who have generously volunteered to come up and share their thoughts. And then our other students are in the class, and all of you in the audience them and anyone who here is spending time with us this morning, you are welcome to participate, to come up to the mic when you want to add something to the conversation, because they want to hear from you, as do we all. So I'd first like to call up the 5 students who have volunteered. Jack Brown, Joanny Espinal, Stephen Nappy, Layla Ruiz, and Benjamin Trink. Okay. I don't see Joanny. She may come. If she comes in, we'll just have her come up to the microphone. And those of you who are in the class, just raise your hand so everybody knows that. Yeah. So these are our students who also helped to put forward the questions for today. So are these microphones on? Okay, so I'm just gonna caution you. Are these the ones? I'm gonna ask if we could also turn on this microphone right here with the red button. Those of you who come up to the microphone, just make sure you don't put your hand on the bottom when you speak, because it will muffle the sound. All right, so I'm gonna ask some questions. We'll see how many we get through. The students will give their responses, and then we'll ask you to chime in. So our first question is for the panel. How many of you are active on social media? You can raise your hand initially. How
we just go down like the row. Yeah.
Okay, very active or just like meh?
Yeah,
Very active.
Very active.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, and what are the platforms that you use?
I'd say like we probably all use like Instagram, Facebook, TikTok,
Snapchat,
Twitter.
You use Facebook?
Yeah, surprisingly.
Okay.
Yeah.
I do
It's
not.
definitely
I
more
don't.
of like a professional thing for me than it is like a social.
Yeah, same.
Like I don't
Okay.
consume media just like regularly on Facebook.
Yeah.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right. That sort of conforms with my view of the world. So how often would you say that you use social media? Like how important is it in your life?
Probably about 2-3 hours a day.
Yeah, I'd agree.
I would say more like 1 to 2 for me personally.
Okay.
It's a lot more for me. A majority of the work that I do, just like even like in my everyday life, happens like on social media. So like even when like sometimes like in between classes or like sometimes even like during meetings, I'm having to like check different like Instagrams and social medias, especially for different organizations. So I would say a lot more in my everyday life, like casually throughout the day. So I don't think you could put like a time, because it's just so often and it's back and forth between like what I want to do and like more professional things that I'm doing online.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I, even for like my internship in public relations, I'm constantly having to use Instagram and Facebook and Twitter to, get in contact with different outlets, reporters, etc. So yeah, I find my days consumed by social media, even like just not out of like, pleasure. A lot of times it's just out of like professional, like work.
Okay. How about you in the audience? Does that jive with your experience? Is there anybody in here who's not on social media? Okay, interesting. All right. So what kinds of content do you find yourself seeing, particularly when you're not doing work?
So for me personally, I love pop music. I enjoy reality TV. I do follow politics. So those 3 things are mostly on my Twitter feed and my For You page.
Okay.
I would say some sports, because I follow sports. Also some music, politics, and then whatever my friends are posting.
Yeah, same like sports, politics, what my friends are posting. Definitely like music and fashion as well. And I'm a big foodie, so definitely like a lot of like, food pictures and videos and stuff.
Do you take pictures of your meals?
If they look nice, yeah, but usually I'm admiring other people's because they make it look nicer.
Okay.
For me, it's mostly, I usually use social media for things like politics, small businesses. I follow a lot of small businesses that I find like on TikTok. And then the last thing would be, gosh, I can't remember, it just slipped my mind, but I use it like mostly for like news and
Okay.
like learning like small snippets of like what's kind of casually happening like around the world.
Okay.
So that's definitely what I focus on.
And does that jive with everybody else? Is there anything on there that you see regularly that our panelists have not mentioned? Something that you think is important in terms of a category of social media content? Okay, so they pretty much covered it. So one of the things we want to talk about today is what the relationship between persuasion and social media and social change. So What are your thoughts about social media use as a way of affecting social change?
I think it's a good way to affect social change, and I think you could see that in the last, probably 2 years. I think specifically, looking back at the Black Lives Matter movement, which was about, like July of 2020, and I think that was like a great medium, for specifically like getting informed on when protests were, locations, times and stuff like that. Also like reposting, pretty important information that's like, relevant to what's going on, like, in world news, domestically. So I think it's a great platform for social change personally.
Okay, I just want to clarify one point. We know that the movement didn't start in 2020.
No,
right?
yeah, but I was just
Okay.
saying that like last summer, like I noticed how like prevalent it was on like social media platforms, and how like, people were able to communicate their thoughts, ideas, and like share information through the use of like things like Instagram, Facebook, Twitter.
And I think I'm hearing you say that logistics are effectively communicated on
Yes,
social media.
exactly.
Like the what time, the where.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay. Anyone else?
So I personally disagree with that. I do not believe social media is a good way to affect social change. Social media is on the internet. It is a good way to draw attention to particular issues. However, letting the general public who may be not informed on a topic speak about it to everyone to hear, I'm not sure if that's the best way. I do think once attention is drawn, individuals can then look up the topic that they have seen and then use credible sources to look into the issues. Does social media change legislation? No, not at all.
Okay.
So I would kind of be on the same line of Steven, but like a little bit less than that. I think it's a good starting place. I think it's also good at like rallying people up, especially like during COVID. We don't have the option to like always be around each other, and for a long time we had to like be strictly quarantined, so it was very helpful in that. But I think we get caught up in this idea that it's going to be like this like all saving thing, that it's going to be the number one thing that pushes us forward. But like Steven says, like you need, like when you see something, it could be a starting point, but continuing to do research after that. But like the general public doesn't do that. It's why we consume social media like on Instagram, because it's that quick, fast. I don't need to go read this whole article. I can read this quick little post about it and be done with my day. But that kind of gets lost in the sauce, and you miss like major details or major, like, for example, Black Lives Matter on that topic. A lot of people were posting like these black squares and using the BLM hashtag, and it was drowning out Black voices that were trying to advocate for a series of needs that needed to be spoken about, but it was drowned out by this idea of allyship and posting these black squares and using the BLM hashtag, and in an attempt to be helpful and I guess allied with the Black Lives Matter movement. People were inherently worsening the impact that it was having, because I mean, nobody was able to read it. Every time you clicked on that hashtag, all you saw were a series of black squares, and what good is that? How is that any like justification for change or a real like movement?
Okay. So TLDR is one. People don't read long things, and the other is that it allyship can drown out actual activist voices. I want you to think a little bit about what allyship, when we get a little bit later in the conversation, what is allyship? Is social media posting allyship, or do you actually have to do something more than that to claim that you're an ally? Ben,
So,
did you want to chime in?
Yeah, building off of that even, I feel like, especially with what she was saying about the black squares, that it's a lot of like a bandwagon effect. Like people are like, oh, my friend is posting this, it's filling up my feed, I have to post this too. And it's people who not necessarily, maybe they weren't against it, but didn't know anything about the movement before, weren't involved. And so you have these people who aren't really involved in an issue, making it seem like they're an activist for this issue. And yes, it does make it easier for people to get dates in terms of protests and stuff. But I feel like at the same time, you would have to be really interested in a topic and really be vocal about it. And you're not just going to decide to go because you see a post on social media. So people who would have gone, I feel like, would have found a way in the past anyways. So I don't think that's really beneficial in getting more people to actually protest and actually do things that push for change. It just makes people more have the appearance of doing things, and people think that they're actually pushing for change when they're not by just posting a black square. So it creates this false hope that you're pushing for change, but we haven't seen much positive change since all these events of July 2020, and everybody thinks they did something because of social media.
Jack, did you have something you wanted to say, or are you just
Well, I
nodding?
feel like a big issue with this also comes down to like a generational kind of like situation where if you think about it, like I feel like, you know, our generation, for example, I don't really think that we're the type of people these days that are kind of consuming news via like CNN, Fox News, like actually watching like, you know, a bona fide news outlet. I feel like we are, you know, living so fast, taking everything in, like we said, like we don't want to read long excerpts or paragraphs. We just want like, you know, the here and now. So I think, you know, an issue is that for one, we're having such personalized news. We're not kind of getting both sides of the spectrum. And then we're also kind of like, we're exporting news the same way I feel like that we're intaking it. Because if we're on Instagram, we're not watching CNN, we're not watching Fox News. We're literally just getting, you know, news that is being, you know, given to us via an algorithm that they think, oh, okay, like you're gonna line up with this viewpoint. So I feel like it kind of leads into like, you know, like we were saying, like people kind of like reposting, which is obviously not a good medium for social media. But in the same token, I feel like if it wasn't for social media, a lot of these issues, granted, you know, maybe people aren't as informed, but they agree with them. That's a better starting point than if there was no outlet, you know, because like I said, I don't think we're gonna go home and watch CNN or Fox News and intake all this information and like go talk about it, you know, like sit down at a coffee shop and discuss, you know, what we just watched, you know, like, you know, whoever just, you know, speak about. So that's why I think, while granted, yeah, you know, there might be a lot of like, you know, situations where, you know, going back to like, you know, the black squares, yeah, that did drown out a lot of like, you know, the activist voices, and that wasn't, you know, a great movement. But in the same token, it did bring on, you know, throughout an entire day, a lot of like, you know, attention to this movement. And then the next day we were able to, you know, go back to it, talk about it more, you know. But again, I think it's a better starting point than we might want to give it credit for.
Okay. So anyone in the audience who would like to add anything? Aria, go for it.
Are you clapping?
Yeah.
Hi, can y'all hear me?
Yeah, just speak out. Just speak up.
Okay. This is a very, very dear topic to my heart because back in Atlanta when all the movements like started happening, I was actually in the streets in Atlanta, and I just want to like piggyback off Steven because like in my point of view, people started dragging it, and like it really hurt to see on TikTok. It became like a trend. You know what I'm saying? You know, like it had that Malcolm song. You know what I'm saying? I don't know what's the name of the song. No freedom till we equal. Damn right.
I know what you're
started
talking
it.
about, yeah.
Same love.
Yeah. Same love. So like they made like, oh, do you support Black Lives Matter? Then maybe like this, you know, have like their white friend and all that stuff. And like, it was just like very stressful because like also like companies, I felt like they had to see a push in like Black diversity, and they wanted to put more Black people in their like on the front lines, but I don't think it was really genuine in a sense. So like, yeah, that's what I have to say. So yeah.
Okay, so I'm hearing you say there was a lot of symbolic stuff. If I
Yeah.
knew the Macklemore song, I would sing it for
Yeah.
you, but I don't. Okay, and that
And also
symbols
with,
are
like,
important, though,
yeah.
no?
Yeah, it was important, but like they started like to turn it into a joke and like turning into like a
Oh.
meme and stuff like that.
Okay.
And with like the black screens also, like it was just a big bandwagon, and I feel like it just started dragging out, and that was like the end of it. You know, after the black screens, people just like stopped caring and like stopped posting about like Black Lives Matter, and it's just like everyone just like stopped forgetting. So like that's all I gotta say.
That's great, Kari.
Thank you.
Those are important points. Yeah. Would anybody else like to, Stephen? Sorry, Vincent.
Yeah, right on our point. I've noticed this myself, and like, you know, throughout the entire Black Lives Matter protest after George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis, there obviously has been some pushes. Like, for instance, in some areas, you have seen the decrease. There have been some defunds of police departments, such as New York City and in Minneapolis. And but we've also seen that some companies have decided to change some things up. For instance, Pepsi decided to remove Aunt Jemima and replace it with the Pearl Milling Company. The NFL decided to remove the Washington Redskins moniker with Washington Football Team, and who knows what they're going to rename it to afterwards. And same thing with the MLB and the Cleveland Indians, and numerous names have been removed. But I've noticed that with a lot of people, they also don't feel it as genuine. Like, the only reason why the Redskins were forced to change their name was because FedEx threatened Dan Snyder that they would leave their partnership and leave their name and take it off of the stadium if they didn't do it. They didn't really want to do it. They just did it because their advertisers forced them. And even with all this stuff, even if you look at a lot of activists on Twitter and like on these social media places, they don't really feel satisfied because they feel like, while they did a lot, at the same time, in their personal view, yeah, Juneteenth was made a national holiday, but that's not good enough for them. I think we live in also an era in which compromise in its very nature is a very no word. It's not something that we really want to do, considering that we want the here and now, and we don't really like to wait for it to happen later, and we're not going to settle for just little bits and compromisation, because that's losing in their eyes.
I have an announcement to make. When you're speaking, you can take your mask off, by the way, so that will help. Thank you, Vincent. You raise a really interesting point that I would like us to think about, and people are welcome to respond to this now or later or just think about it, and that is, do intentions matter? I mean, does it matter if a business changes a really grossly offensive logo because of economic pressure, as long as the logo gets changed? So I think we should think about that. Do people's, because can we ever change what's in people's hearts, or can we just push people with external pressure so that they do the right thing because the consequences of not are costly? Please come on up. You're welcome to remove your mask when you speak.
Well, it's very interesting. I'm Alex, by the way, Alex. But it's a very interesting thought when we talk about the insensitivities of the internet. The internet's a very weird place where there's a lot of sensitive people and a lot of insensitive people. And there's a constant war, going on, to where you have so many, mean and cruel people posting all these things that are very insultive. But like generally sometimes low-key being funny. But then you have really, really soft people making a big deal out of really small things, or even most of the time major things, but really small and minuscule things, and blow it up out of proportion all the time. And that's a really big issue within the social media. I don't think it can be really fixed, sadly, but it also depends on the social media platform that you're on also, because I feel a lot of different social medias have different tendencies. So like if you're on, like, let's say Instagram and Twitter, people may take what you say differently than if you're on Reddit. Reddit, is just a completely different atmosphere than Instagram and Snapchat. Even if you take like the new and up and coming Discord, it's not really new, it's been around for a while. But people treat that completely different, and it's very big, but they treat it as an entirely different entity as some place like Snapchat or Instagram. And, that place is a bit more crazy. When I say crazy, as in more insensitive people. Like, you have a bunch of 12 and 13-year-olds using all these types of, language on there. So it's just really interesting to think about how, there's these two wars going on between the very sensitive and insensitive people.
Tell me your name again?
Alex.
Alex, that's a really interesting point, and it's actually a question that we had wanted to address. I'm going to reframe it a little bit, but I thank you for introducing it. One of the things that we talked about in class is how so much of the discourse on social media is steeped in emotion. And I think that's, both whether you're insensitive or sensitive, right? It's an emotional kind of discourse. And I think your contribution is really interesting because what I'm hearing you say, and I think, you all might agree, is that there are different norms that govern behavior on different social media platforms. But it seems like the thing that carries through is this emotional tone. And one of the things we talked about in class is that sometimes it feels like having the right position on an issue feels like a moral imperative, right? That one of our panelists talked about, like, there's not a lot of disagreement of other sides. and that you have to demonstrate that you have the right opinion, or people will get very upset with you one way or the other. So one of the questions I wanted to ask the panel is, one of the problems with social media is that there's just too much pathos and not enough kind of engagement of a more substantive kind?
I would say most definitely, you know, for trying to persuade people, going about it with pure emotion is not the right solution, because you have to think about, what does the other side think? Where do they stand on this issue, and how can I convince them to go to my side of this issue? I doubt that very many people here at all have been changed about a single political or social view based off something that they just saw somebody repost on social media, because lots of the time it's people saying, this is terrible, and not this is terrible and here's why. People aren't given the facts, they're given, I feel that this needs to change. And in order to really persuade somebody and make them change, if you think left and they think right, and you're not giving them reason to change other than, I think this way, they're going to be like, well, I think this way. You need to be, well, this is the issue, this is how it started, this is who it's affecting, and this is how we can change it and why we need to change it. And the way that things currently are, people feel it's more important to just post how they feel than post about genuine change.
Okay, so in a perfect world, yes, I do agree with you. We should focus more on ethos than pathos. However, I believe that this argument doesn't account for the fact that we are still human beings with emotions and feelings, and how can we just like turn them off in a snap? I won't lie, I am too emotional about issues with homophobic legislation and environmental changes, amongst other things. I'm rooted in emotions for that, because this is my future. This is policies that affect me directly. And how do you expect me not to be emotional with this? So yes, it would be good if we could all think logically and use facts. However, I don't see that ever happening.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think you can't have persuasion without emotion. You've never like seen like a politician like, you know, run for president and just be super just like, yeah, so here's what I want to do. And then like, that's it. You know, you need to have emotion. I think the tough part is trying to filter out, you know, the right amount of emotion with the right amount of like, you know, information and facts. But I agree, we're human beings. We're going to be passionate about things. It's just a thing about trying to train ourselves subconsciously to like, you know, be able to provide the facts, you know, in a way that our emotions aren't overclouding them. But I agree that, you know, you can't have change and you can't advocate for change without showing emotion towards the issue at hand.
Okay, Layla?
I think a large reason why we see emotion just like so prevalent is because for a long time, like minority groups were not humanized. They were just numbers on a paper. They were statistics. They weren't considered human. And I think social media has given us the opportunity to essentially humanize folk, to humanize us, to, it's not just in journal, in like an article where like this person, where they're not really given details and they just explain the what happened, but we're not given the how did this affect that person in everyday life? How are we looking at different communities? How are they affected by it? What are they saying about their emotions and how they're feeling? And how are we actually relating that information in media? Like a lot of times it isn't. So that's why a lot of folk turn to the emotion, because it's like we're not, especially like, for example, when we were looking at the ICE detention centers and when all of that really awful stuff was happening and is still happening now, that a lot of it was just like numbers on a piece of paper. It was, okay, these are the amount of immigrants we are having coming across the border. This is why we have this many people in ICE detention centers. And then all of these videos and stories and voices started to come forward about how they were feeling personally, not just like what they were experiencing, but their emotions, the fear, the sadness, the violence that they were experiencing was all able to garner a different kind of support, because it was like, damn, like I can relate to that. I may not be an immigrant, but I'm a mom. I am a sister. I'm a cousin. That is someone, like, as a human being, we have to understand. And like sometimes there is like a limit, like there's a such thing as like trauma porn, and like there is an extent where we should limit on how much we're like recirculating violent videos, but that doesn't change the fact that we still need to be able to humanize ourselves, and in everyday like government and politics and and every other instance we're not, and a lot of other minority folk are also just like not, and we're all victims of the algorithm. We're focusing so much on social media, but at the end of the day, like our For You pages, our feeds are all filled with exactly what we want to see. We don't see outside of what we want. Like someone on the panel says that they don't get like the what. On my Instagram feed, I always get like the what happened and then the kind of extended version too, but other folk don't. TikTok is really, really good at your For You page because it gives you almost the exact content that you want to see. So we're literally like trying to fix the problem that was created by the very folk who created the tools we're trying to essentially use to fix this problem. They shadow ban minority folk all the time. They demonetize. They take profiles down. People abuse the algorithm to try and get other accounts taken down. Like it's just a mess of things where like social media is a good place to kind of start, but like if we let it just end there, then we're all putting ourselves in a hole of just absolute nothing because we will never get anywhere from there.
Layla, really rich comments there. A couple things I just want to call out. One is I think you do a good job stressing the importance of narrative, that sometimes statistics and bullet points are not compelling. I think, and I think that's a really important point. And the other is empathy, right? That a narrative, particularly one with emotional content, can generate empathy or help to generate empathy. So I think those are really important points. I want to ask, based on something you just said, jump to another question. How does the fact that social media platforms are run by profit-driven corporations affect our use of these platforms and their potential for affecting change?
Okay, so I think they 100% limit it. Facebook, Instagram, they're all owned by the same person, but they have the actual ability to change their algorithm to produce better content for you. They have the algorithm to produce violent rhetoric towards younger generations. They have the ability to do those things because the technology exists, and they choose not to, which just goes to show that technology, and not just technology, but social media in and of itself will never be the catch-all solution because it is a private, monetized, business. And so we are all, like I said, victims of the algorithm because they take our data, they use it for money, they use it for advertisements, and then they reproduce that so that they can profit off of this. Not a single person in here is a priority in the eyes of this business. We are all numbers to them, and the more we use social media, the more they profit off of it. And unfortunately, we can't take social media out of our everyday lives, but that's why we have to emphasize that social media may be a good place to start, but you have to go beyond that. You have to talk to people, you have to read books, you have to read articles, you have to listen to podcasts, follow people's Patreons. There are options out there for education that are often free, and there's literature for people who literally studied this for 20 something years and beyond, who've lived these but are also well educated in these topics. And so unless we actually sit there and go beyond social media, it's never going to get anywhere.
Well, and also we talked about in class, right, how it actually is profitable for social media, that we're so hyper emotional, particularly when we hate on people, right? That hate actually drives ratings and feeds the algorithm. So the more we are driven by our hatred for people who disagree, the more, Mark Zuckerberg and company profit, right? Anybody else want to address that?
Yeah. So Mark Zuckerberg is the founder and CEO of Facebook, and as Layla says, they also own Instagram. So I have a figure here that states Zuckerberg's net worth. It's $116 billion. I'll repeat that. $116 billion. I'm going to give you a few seconds to think about that figure. 116 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0 0. We live in a capitalistic society, so bottom line, profits. Mark Zuckerberg and his $116 billion net worth, what does he want to do? He wants to maintain that and have that number keep going up and up and up. If promoting social change is going to be in his best interest to increase profits, sure, that's what Facebook will do. However, if Facebook and Instagram sees that this is not the best way to generate profits, the algorithm will show posts that are not promoting social change. This is one of the reasons why using social media as a sole form of advocacy is highly problematic.
Yeah, I agree. I think a big problem, kind of going back to Vincent's point, about how a lot of these big corporations, advocate for social change, but then you could just see right through that smokescreen and tell that it's just super, just ungenuine. Again, it's just all about profit and whether or not that movement's going to fall in line with, the quota that they're trying to fill. So I feel like you can't take the social changes that big corporations are doing to heart, and you can't really take it seriously. I think you always need to approach that with a grain of salt, because if Facebook right now were to go on some massive, pro whatever kind of thing, or like, take a stand on a social change, I'd know immediately that that is not how you genuinely feel. This is clearly just going to help raise your profit margin. So I think that's kind of like the approach I personally take when it comes to like, taking in information from these massive corporations.
I would definitely have to agree with that, especially with the recent events. Like you look at the internal Facebook documents with the whistleblower, that they did internal studies that showed that social media, specifically Instagram, with likes and different aspects, were extremely toxic and causing mental health issues for many teenagers, especially teenage girls. And they knew exactly what the issue is, but they chose to bury the documents instead of doing something to change, because actually those insecurities that it created of people getting more likes or people getting less likes just drove people to use the platform more because they need to feel as popular or go support their friends so that their friends didn't feel that way. So if this organization did research that showed that they were damaging people, that they were the issue in this case, and they buried it instead of making change, why are they going to try and make change about issues that they didn't create, that different things in society created? Why are they going to try and change that if they're not creating societal issues that they're knowingly creating and refusing to fix?
Great. Okay, good. I like that we're moving away from the do they really mean it to are they going to pursue their self-interest rather than actual social change, right? Because it doesn't matter if Mark Zuckerberg means it. It matters if it actually would be good for all of us, right? Whether he means it or not, if it helps me, I'll take it. But if it doesn't, then I don't care whether he means it or not. So maybe that's something we want to think about. Would anyone from the audience come on down? I don't know if you know The Price is Right, but that's... I could do that. I could be Bob Barker.
Hi, I'm Annabelle.
Hi, Annabelle.
And this morning, I actually read an article in Washington Post about how Facebook, part of their algorithm we were talking about, it gave 5 times as much, I don't know what they call it, kind of monetary power to an angry emoji response rather than a like response. So that kind of goes back to using people's emotions, and instead of putting logical information out there, it's straight to people's anger and emotions. And then it kind of related that back to the Stop the Steal and all the January 6th events, because that's kind of how all those posts were so popular on people's Facebooks, because they were getting angry responses and really firing up people's emotions. So then they popped up more and more and more.
So it's it's in the best interest of these social media platforms, not that we actually promote alliances and cooperation and change, but that we hate each other.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody? Miri?
On average, 40% of people get their news from Twitter and Facebook, as we talked about. Is this only problematic in relation to political sense, or do you actually look at the credibility, what the source is, what the person is that's actually behind this? Is this just because we're an instantaneous generation, we just want things quickly? When you go through Instagram, it's just right there. And unless you delve deeper, then you're not going to get all the facts. You just look at it instantaneously. I think that's it.
What do you think? 40? Did you say 40%, Mary?
Yeah.
Wow.
I would say it is problematic, even in everyday life, because like I said, even for example, I follow a series of meme pages. The amount of times they're reposting what seems like news happens all the time. Pages that are beyond, that are not specifically related to politics or news or really anything at all, that just kind of post fun things, will be posting or reposting everyday news that they think they just want to repost, and who literally have no idea who's behind these accounts. And they have millions of followers on them, and who knows like who's behind these accounts. And there's been, of course, previous times where I'd have to find it. I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, but there's been a number of times in which like people have believed that like these pages have been run by like Black folk, and then they'll be reposting it thinking that they're like reposting something that's been generated content by the Black community, only to find out that it's like a white woman. And it's like for like months people feel that they've been essentially bamboozled because people are reusing their voices even though you're not seeing their faces. They're allowing their like audiences to believe a certain thing. And so it's just in and of itself, like in an everyday like content, it is problematic.
I definitely agree. I mean, if you think about everything with the recent vaccinations, there's lots of articles going around, especially Facebook, I'd say, with people around 40, 50. I feel like it's going around there a lot, but it's everywhere too. Like, I bet you a lot of people here heard that the vaccine caused a magnet to stick to your arm. Mm-hmm. Obviously, that's not true, but I know a bunch of people who believed it, and my circle doesn't even tend to be people who read into those types of conspiracy theory type of allegations, let's say. So if it's being able to be that widespread, something that's clearly false, it shows the power that these news sources, as people say, have, and that people receiving their news, because anything could be written by anyone. It's kind of like how, in class, if you're writing a research paper, they tell you you can't use Wikipedia as a source. Facebook, Instagram, other social media are kind of the Wikipedia for news, in that anyone can say anything and you read it as fact, whereas this person could have no credibility whatsoever.
Yeah, I completely agree with the sentiments of both Layla and Ben. So I just wanted to build a little more off Layla's point. I've heard so many people say, oh, no, don't worry, I won't listen to the meme page and what they say about politics. I know, I'll only listen to the people that have that little blue check mark showing they're verified. Guess what? People are verified for a plethora of reasons. It's not just because you're a journalist, you're in politics. You could be in entertainment. I'm not sure about you, but I don't want to be getting my politics from a person on The Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. It's incredibly problematic just to listen to people because they are verified for something of some sorts.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like a big problem too is that we give the wrong people like too high of like a platform. Like I know people who will die on a hill for like whatever like Kim Kardashian has to say, and I'm like, but like is she really like the biggest voice that we could think of when it comes to like a social issue or something like that? So I feel like again it comes down to like who we're getting our news from, like what they have to say. I mean, granted, I remember when Trump was still president, there was a bunch of articles that were going around like spreading false news about him that were like very popular, and then it came back that like it was just like 5 guys from like Eastern Europe who made like hundreds of thousands of dollars just literally just typing away in their bedroom, just writing random things, and millions of people took that as fact. So I think a big problem is where we're getting our outlets from, who is the person behind the screen, and just genuinely how we just intake our news in general, because there is so much just false information out there.
So I want to add, and then I'll invite people if they want to respond. So this is an interesting, so in Rhetoric, we have a concept called Ethos, which essentially translates into, what is your character as the source of a message, right? Are you credible? Are you similar to me? And are you a credible source, right? So you are, and the most ideal source is somebody who's kind of like me, but kind of different, right? So, in my case, it would be, I don't know, someone who's female, grew up working class, but has a medical expertise that I don't, that I could listen to about COVID vaccines, for example. That would make them what we call super representative. But one of the things we talked about in class, and I take all your comments very well, and I thank Miri for introducing that, is that, you don't want to listen to Kim Kardashian, but one of the things that students brought up in class is there's also a different ethos issue, and I think that Layla kind of alluded to it, which is increasingly sometimes you find yourself in a conversation and people say, you don't have the right to talk about that. And it's not because you don't have the expertise, it's because you don't fit the profile of, if it's a woman's issue, you need to be a woman to talk about that. And so the question is, can we build the kind of coalitions and alliances we need for social change if we say to people, no ethos, you may not talk about this?
Well, I think it's not so much that. I think it's more like, because you want everybody to have a say and a voice, but it's like, I think when it comes to like your main kind of like figure for like a particular movement and like who's going to be kind of like spearheading the movement, that should be somebody who's like the most well-informed person of like that group. And that's nothing against Kim Kardashian. I'm sure she has a lot of great things to say, but but again, is she the best person to lead a group of people about climate change? I don't know. Probably not. We probably have somebody who could, she could definitely be a supporter of that, but I think we could definitely pick a better, person to kind of lead the charge for a certain social issue. So that's what I was kind of trying to allude to.
Okay.
I'm kind of like on the like weird line of things. It's like where if you aren't fitting a certain identity, you should not be at the head of a movement. Like it's one thing to like talk about like an issue that's happening among like obviously a number of minority folk experience real issues, and we should talk about that. Like even if you aren't a part of those identities, you absolutely should be talking about those things. But a big issue with like, especially if you look at like feminism movements, those were started by Black women, and if you look at it now, a lot of the kind of generic like forefront people are white women, and it kind of steals away from the true nature of those movements when it was talking about not just women's rights, but the intersectionality of women of color particularly, and those kinds of parts of movements get drowned out because we start like people are like, oh my god, like I now want to do this. And it's like, that's great. Like, yes, like that enthusiasm is absolutely like where it needs to be, but it's kind of misplaced a little bit sometimes when wanting to like be at the front. Like sometimes like, sure, we want that, but like sometimes it just isn't our place to, because there are people who have real voices, and it sometimes just isn't our place to impede on them. And on top of that, like if you aren't a part of a certain community, you shouldn't speak on their behalf. And I've often heard that. I've often seen that on social media of like folks speaking on the behalf, and it's like, you can't do that. Like if you're like talking about like statistics and facts and real issues, like sure, absolutely have those discussions, but like it's not your job to speak on the behalf of a community at all, period, especially if you're not like on like a part of that identity.
I have to agree with that to an extent, because yes, it should be people who obviously are going through the issues, have a real say, who know more than somebody who's just watching it happen. But at the same time, it's also important for people who are not in that group necessarily, because like, for example, I'm Jewish, and anti-Semitism, I'm sure everybody's seen a statistic posted or something, but has been on the rise in recent years very much. And we make up a very small percentage of the population. So if we don't have people who are not Jewish by our side helping to fight against the rise in anti-Semitism, nothing's going to change because of what a small percentage of the population we are. So yes, it is important for people who are experiencing these things to be at the forefront and be the most vocal, but at the same time, it's very important to have allies who aren't in the same community or group as you working with you, because lots of the time, these are minority groups other than women. Most of these groups that are going through these issues are minorities. So if you don't have at least a good percentage or the majority on your side, you're not going to get much change done.
Yeah, I think honestly more so for in a press group that's fighting for equality, you should be a member of the press group if you want to be at the forefront. If you want to help advocate for them, okay, do it behind the scenes. Don't go and steal someone's thunder. That's not right.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, if you're not, directly experiencing, the issue at hand, let somebody else take, the spotlight who is and can actually speak on the matter and give their own, experiences and input on it. And like, we said, just, if you want to support, you most definitely can. But I think there's a tasteful way to do so without kind of taking away the credibility from like those who are really experiencing it.
I think it's also just like you have to acknowledge your privilege. Like minority folk are not voiceless. They have voices. They're actively using them. But as like people with privilege, especially like white folk or like light-skinned folk, that privilege exists because we're more likely to be listened to than someone who is quite honestly darker, because that's the reality of the system that we live in, is that people are directly targeted based on the complexion of their skin. And that, unfortunately, like, people kind of sometimes like don't realize, but like your active privilege sometimes is actively harming somebody else, even though your intentions are good, even though your intentions are like, yeah, I want to be an ally, yeah, I want to help the movement. But it's like, if you don't realize your own privilege, and then you're kind of inserting yourself into is where it's supposed to be a safer space for folk that are more directly impacted by it, then that's when it really becomes problematic. Because like, if you're kind of like what Stephen was saying, honestly, like, I think he put it perfectly.
Yeah, I think Layla mentioned a really important point. Colorism is real. A lot of people who aren't super informed on an issue think, okay, just because you are, let's say, Black, if you are a darker skin tone, you may face more oppression. Well, you will face more oppression than someone who's a lighter skin tone. So colorism is something that definitely has to be talked about, made more mainstream.
Let me throw a wrench into this, because I'm hearing a tension between what Layla's saying and what Ben's saying. And I'm actually hearing a tension in what Layla's saying. So if you need to persuade people, if you need to get people on board who don't already agree, and certain members of your group are more credible, and others, because people don't hold them in high regard, are less credible, why would you elevate the less credible voices all the time? So like, what if you want to speak to an audience, I don't know, about abortion rights, and they're going to take the argument better if it comes from a man? Do I go in and say, too bad, I'm a woman, you're not, and you need to center me because the guy who might speak, who you might actually find more persuasive, is not justifiably the voice of this movement? So in other words, when do strategies and tactics become important beyond the ethos of, well, okay, we need to lift this voice? What if that voice is not as compelling as this voice who would make the same case?
I think that goes back to also what we were saying about, do we care if Mark Zuckerberg is genuine and wanting to make change as long as what he does helps the issues? Because me personally, I feel like, people are more likely to listen to somebody who's not a minority, somebody who they relate with more. Like we talk in class, like you mentioned before, super representative. If we have, obviously, I think people in a certain group that are facing issues are all going to want change, The problem isn't convincing the people who are facing oppression. The problem is convincing the bystanders. And if you need people who look like them or have more traits in common with them to try and bring change, I think you need to do whatever you can to help promote your group and help promote your minority and help bring the change that you need. Because at the end of the day, it matters more that you have the change, that you are brought towards equality, that there's less violence against your group. Because I believe the statistic is, for example, there are 2% of people in America are Jewish. 2% are not going to bring any change. And many people who are anti-Semitic are not going to listen to somebody Jewish speak on the topic. If one of their colleagues who happens to be, if they're, let's say, Catholic and they're both Catholic, are like, hey, Jesus was a Jew, we shouldn't be hating against them, more likely to listen to that than listen to a Jewish person say, don't hate against us. So I think it's important to have other people working on the issue with us. And yes, it's important to listen to the roots and go back to, these are the people who are being oppressed in any sort of minority situation. And remember and know that this is why you're fighting for change. But at the same time, you need people who are not of the oppressed group to help bring about that change.
Yeah, two things. One, so ethos is always audience-centered. It matters less what I think will be persuasive in a particular situation than what you think, right? And I think that's what Ben's trying to say. And then the other thing I've heard, and I believe this to be true, is that people consistently overestimate the percentage of the population that belongs to particular quote-unquote minority groups. So Black people are 13% of the population. People consistently overestimate how much, they'll say 30%, 33%. I don't know if Jews are 2% of the population, But that's a really, I think, provocative point, is that if you need to change and you're 2% of the population, you can't do all the talking because you won't convince people. But we had hands up, and I want to get Annalisa and then some voices from the back.
Just really quickly though, I
Go ahead.
wasn't
Sorry,
saying, like, just to
Layla.
quickly clarify, I just literally, like, just a quick sentence. I'm not saying that, like, if you're, like, in a particular identity, like, you should be the only one fighting for it. I just think that, like, if you are in a particular identity group, like, for a movement, you should be, like, those should be the folk at the forefront. It shouldn't be folk who are outside of that identity at the forefront, but absolutely, like, there needs to be, like, it's either, like, all of us or none of us kind of thing, because, like, unfortunately, like, there, like you said, like, statistically speaking, like, there just aren't enough people to, like, statistically, like, make all of that change happen. The reality is that it has to be a larger group of folk, and that's why we have to, like, start also, like, tearing down, like, these kind of issues among, like, minority groups that have, like, against each other
Right.
sometimes too as well. But, like, aside from that, like, I'm not saying, like, there should just be, like, just because your identity is, like, you should be in it, but, like, those should be the folk at the forefront. You as, like me as a non-Black person shouldn't be going in and, like, trying to be at the head of the Black Lives Matter movement and trying to, like, start doing all of this, like, organizing and, like, making myself the face of it, because, like, I'm not Black, so that's not my place.
But you might be persuasive for an audience.
Right, but, like, that would, again, I wouldn't be the forefront of the movement.
Right,
That would be
good.
like,
Yep,
that would be organized by
absolutely.
someone else, and so.
Okay, great. I think that's an important distinction, Layla. Annalisa.
Hello, I'm Annalisa. I'm also in the Persuasion class. I think that this is, like, an interesting discussion because, you know, with social justice and activism, you're fighting corruption, and corruption is strategic, so activism has to be strategic. And I think going back to emotions on social media, I feel like activism is selfish because you're being an activist on social media so that you feel better. Like, sharing this graphic is gonna make you feel like you did something. And emotions makes it hard to compromise. But in, you know, a scenario like that, like if I'm advocating for Black Lives Matter and I'm talking to a Latin audience and they want to listen to me, it's, although that's not the ideal, that's what is the reality. And when you're talking to companies, especially about environmentalism, if you're at A and they're at Z, there's no way you're going to get them to come to A, so you have to meet somewhere in the middle. And I think that that's the ugly reality of activism, and that, like, for example, when I talk to Latin activists, people that aren't from America, that are from El Salvador or from Dominican Republic, they're a lot more strategic with what they do and a lot more aggressive as well. And I'm not saying that violence is the answer, but when I talked to an activist from El Salvador, he was a guerrilla, like, in El Salvador and fought against the government. And when we asked him, you know, how do we be involved? How do we connect to our roots of where we're from to help with activism? And social media was nowhere on his explanation. And I think it's great, like we talked about, for organization and awareness, but when it comes to actually doing something, it's a mixture of strategic things, which includes the ethos that we were talking about and finding people that are credible to talk to different audiences depending on who you're trying to cater to, which sucks. But I think that's what our generation has a hard time, is that we don't like compromising because, you know, we find this is important, and this reflection of what we think about this topic is our person and our personality and our persona, but it's so much more than that. And for change to happen, it's going to take a lot more than that. So I think that that's, like, touches on a lot of the stuff that we've talked about today.
Annalisa's always our strategist in class, I have to tell you. She's always focused on activist strategies, but I think she raises a point that we've returned to many times, which is you don't deal with the audience that you want, you deal with the audience that you have, right? And it's not about how you feel, it's about how you can get them to change, which means thinking outside of your head to get inside their head. And if I'm summarizing you correctly, right? And that's something we've been coming back to in Persuasion all the time. Someone else had a hand up please jump in.
Hi, my name is Cody.
You need to speak up, Cody,
Oh,
or take your mask off. It's up to
okay.
you.
I feel like with social media, you have to weigh the balance between getting your points actually heard through the majority, but at the same time, having your groups, like with the Black Lives Matter movement, It's very disarming to have a non-Black person kind of running it. And I think Layla was talking about Instagram groups that had been under the persona of being run by people of color as a minority voice. And then it was a white woman who was like assuming the persona to better understand where they're coming from is what they had apologized for, which was very concerning. But at the same time, with social media, you can't put the burden of information on that minority group because they may have generational trauma. They may have their own personal trauma that they're working through. And so you can't expect people of color or different groups to be the ones to explain every single point to you. And I think also within our different groups that we're a part of, we have to recognize the intersectionality between all of our issues, because as soon as we do that, then we're more likely to understand each other and actually get progress going.
Those are excellent. Tell me your name again.
Cody?
Excellent points, Cody. One of the things, again, I would throw a little wrench in this is one of the things we've talked about in persuasion classes, if you want the change, you have to be the one to actually bring the issues forward. So how do we balance that with small numbers, fatigue, right? So I think these are interesting strategic questions to think about. Joanny?
Hello everyone, I'm Joanny. So the points I wanted to bring up was when thinking about activism and strategy, I can't help but to think about consumerism and the way that social media has really impacted us as a society. I feel like it's very capitalistic, and in order for something to be pushed, it needs to be something that people can consume. So how can like a TikTok video have 10 million views, but a post about activism and like Black Lives Matter, well, not even Black Lives Matter, because I feel like it was a lot of consumerism for that. But a smaller post like what's happening in Haiti is not like promoted or talked about. And I feel like there has to be a fine line between like ethos. So like there are people that are well informed about the information, but sometimes you need someone that can actually push the message. So I bet you like if Charlie D'Amelio wasn't like doing the whole Black Lives Matter stick, then a lot of people wouldn't really have that cover photo as their profile picture. I think there just has to be a fine line between like having the people that are popular being informed on the backhand. So sometimes you need to use those things as a strategy. That's my point.
Yeah, terrific, terrific. Ryan.
Good morning. So I think it's interesting to talk about this because a lot of what we've been talking about so far has been this sort of idea that you only have one person speaking at a time. You have to keep in mind that because these organizations and these activist movements can be multiple people, and they have to be multiple people as we've discussed, it doesn't have to be just one person. You can have a person of the sort of dominant ideology that introduces someone else with more information and more credibility, and in that way it can be sort of a teamwork effort. It doesn't just have to be A or B. It doesn't just have to be like a white person speaking on behalf of Black Lives Matter, and it doesn't just have to be Black people speaking on behalf of Black Lives Matter. A combination of the two, and a combination of all races and all individuals that eventually build support is what's necessary. I also had a question about emotions. So we were talking earlier about how anger is very important and how different emotions are important and how empathy is important. I'm curious if you think that the sort of outrage that can be inspired on social media doesn't go anywhere, because on social media you can just voice that outrage and then it dissipates. Because emotion is so important in actually getting boots on the ground to go do things in real life. But if now we have outrage that is just exploded into the ether of social media, and then they can just sit on their couch and watch TV instead, do you think that social media in that way dampens the effect that the attention raising of social media might otherwise have? Or do you think that the attention raising is still important for getting more people invested in the movement than would otherwise be?
So I just want to clarify. So you're saying when you post an angry post, there's catharsis, right? Which is that emotional release. You probably learn about it in literature and theater class, right? There's catharsis, and then you're done. So what do you think about the cathartic function? Does the cathartic function of social media inhibit its capacity to actually inspire you or anybody else to do more?
In its current state, yes, I would say so. Because I feel like social media is very much a bubble where people post and it's like its own world. It's its own little online world. And I feel like that bubble is slowly breaking as you have younger people in office, like Erna Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's very active on social media, and not only active in the way that, let's say, Trump was in posting whatever he wants, but very active in seeing what other people are posting. And I feel like over time, as we have younger people and a new generation taking office and people who have this experience before they were in office of interacting with other people on social media, that bubble will burst. And as we become more technologically savvy throughout all the generations, that it will not be a bubble anymore because everybody will be using it. So it will become a more genuine and valid source to post opinions and to help bring about change. But in its current state, where the past two presidents have been in their 70s and lots of senators are in their 60s and 70s, it is a bubble as of now because it's not really reaching the people who have the power to make change.
I think that's a very optimistic approach. I don't necessarily agree with that. As generations continue to go on, more technology is going to be advanced. In 50 years from now, we're going to be looking at the youngest generation saying, oh, what is this new technology? Back in my day, we had Twitter, we had Instagram. Oh, this is so much better. I don't want to go engage with this new technology. So while, yeah, that would be...
Welcome to my world.
So yeah, well, that would be ideal. The anger that's seen on social media is just like, if you see the tweets, I'm here to vent. And then you have the text wall. And then in the comments, oh, I agree with you. I support you. I'm so sorry. DM me. We can talk about it. Yeah, that's a good way to get things off your chest. But does it lead to anything productive in the real world? Unfortunately, no.
Yeah, I would agree that you do see a lot of like performative activism, like, you know, slacktivism. Where it's just people, yeah, you know, like a lot of like the bandwagoning going back to, you know, that blackout day on Instagram, you know, that was just very performative, people thinking like, oh, I really did something today, when in reality, you know, it kind of flooded out information. So I think it's about, you know, like we were saying, like it's a great starting point, but you can't just have like your entire movement revolve around like what you post or say on social media, because again, like that's never gonna reach, you know, the people in power that are actually, you know, the ones in charge of making like the change. So yeah, you know, you can't just be a performist on social media having people think like, oh my gosh, Jack is so woke and like, oh my God, he knows so much. Like, no, because if I'm just reposting things, I very well, like we've been saying, you know, I could not know. So I think it's just about having like your actions match what you are saying on social media, or else it's just performative at that point.
Also, like, you don't have to post anything at all and you can still be largely engaged in activism. Like, you don't, like, social media is, I mean, tons of people just, like, often I see some social media pages, all they do is, like, repost folk who, like, are in need of money, and they'll, like, repost their handles, and oftentimes people will send them money, and they don't go around, like, reposting, like, hey, I just sent this person money because they're in need, like me and follow me, please, now. But aside from that, from what I understood your question as, is, like, the cathartic release of like being of like kind of like helpful within mental health. I think maybe not, but like that's how I kind of took your question, and I think it is super helpful, and kind of going off what Stephen was saying, it's kind of against it, but like still using the same kind of example of like when you post something, there's often a community of people that you can find that are like, at least you're not alone, honestly. Like, the world has taught us, and honestly, COVID has taught us how much we need each other and need a community. And it's hard. It's hard to talk to people aside from COVID, like even before. Like, it's hard to go out and find new people, but social media gave us that opportunity to be able to say, hey, like, I'm also going through this similar struggle. Often people don't have families that are like accepting of their identities. And so sometimes people turn to social media as a cathartic release of not only saying like, I'm tired of the world, like sometimes it's tiring at the end of the day to have to deal with so much stuff, and every day like this is the stuff we have to talk about. This is like my everyday like school and life, personally, professionally, it's exhausting. And social media is also exhausting. Constant post after post of just circulating media. I mean, it's draining. And so sometimes it's like I just need to put out into the world, like I'm fed up, I'm done. It's kind of like a release. It's like kind of like I'm gonna write it down and throw it away. I'm gonna write it here, I'm gonna let go of it, and I'm gonna move on from here. And I think it's just super helpful. Very often people are like, I'm not really looking to like have a conversation. I just need someone to hear me for a second. And social media allows that, especially like through stories. You don't have to directly interact, but you can see people like even then like clicking and viewing your stories and stuff.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's definitely a great release. It's phenomenal for your mental health. I will say I'm here to vent tweet on multiple occasions. But the issue with that is it's good for your mental health. It's good to bring awareness, but it's not activism. It's not gonna
But I would argue again, like how is your mental health not a part of like you cannot like like I said, it's a heavy topic. Like most people who consider themselves activists, there are people who talk about their genuine mental health. And so kind of going back, Annalisa spoke about a speaker that we had come speak to, Hofstra, and his name is Roberto Lobato. He's like she said, a journalist from El Salvador. And he was speaking about how mental health, like he got into yoga, he got into breathing, he got into focusing on his mental health because it was necessary in order to move forward about like dealing with change. Like you're directly going against the state. You're directly going against the people who would quite literally rather see you die than see you thrive. And it's an unfortunate reality that a lot of people live, and there has to be a release. There has to be
I don't think you're contradicting each other.
Oh, okay.
I
don't think so.
I mean, that helps you get back in the ring. But
Yeah.
I think
Well,
Stephen's point is there's a difference between being in the ring and doing the stuff you need to get back into the ring.
Right, but that's what I'm
Like
saying.
training isn't a game. Like if you're training, you're not competing. Doesn't mean you can compete without training.
Oh, but that's what I think I'm more focusing on. Like I think training, even in and of itself, I'm like I think also someone else brought up like, why are we always expecting like people to just like always be constantly like those specific voices all the time? But it's still kind of like it is like we're talking about folk who every day have to see on social media, on news, really heartbreaking things that directly affect a lot of people's mental health. So finding ways to release and relieve yourself, I think in and of itself is.
But I think again, like people do that because their job is bad too, or people do that because their home life is bad. So to say that that's activism, then how do you distinguish between I'm doing that because I had a bad day at work, right? I mean, so I think that's Stephen's point, is that that's not unimportant, but to say that that's activism is maybe stretching the difference. But I do want to get us to one more thing that I think this would be an unconcluded conversation if we didn't. And we can continue that discussion. So I'm hearing implicit in the comments is we can't change things with just the number of people who are directly hurt by them. We need to build coalitions. We need to get people on board who don't already agree with us. And that sometimes, I think Annalisa's point is a really good one, that means we got to think about where they are, not where we want them to be. And that's the reality of activism. And that's not a 21st century reality. That's a reality as long as things have needed to change. So what I want to ask you is, are there better alternatives for communicating to build the kind of coalitions we need to affect the kind of social changes that we want?
I don't think there's a better way, unfortunately. I think this is it's so embedded, like social media particularly is so strictly embedded. Like it's hard to not be on social media. It's hard not to have an account. It's hard to like be disconnected because unfortunately, like even like for work, like you're required to have these things. And so I think that there's no better way of rallying folk. Like we've never seen before this quickly of folk being able to, sometimes it's even behind like, even if you're just like looking at conspiracy theories or like cults, like very quickly they garner a lot more support. I mean, there was like let's raid some alien invasion in like I can't remember, but like on Facebook, there was some sort of like, hey y'all, let's all raid this like one
Area
place.
51.
There you go, Area 51, right? And very quickly, like people were able to like sign up for this event and like people showed up. Like it was a real thing that happened. And so I think it very quickly allows us to circulate things in a way that just never existed before.
Yeah, like don't get me wrong. Like I think like one of my favorite forms of activism is like just a good old fashioned protest. Like go outside like City Hall, protest, speak your mind. But again, how did I probably find out the time and date and location of that? Via social media. And going back to my point about how we consume news, not via the actual outlet on television, but through, Twitter and Instagram, is, those outlets aren't gonna like have us just like, pitch to them and be like, hey, would you mind like, throwing on, like before a commercial break, oh, meet up, outside City Hall so we could like protest. No, they're never gonna do that. So as much as social media might sometimes we feel like be too little of a say on matters, like I've been saying, I think it's a great starting point because every time I've ever gone to an actual on-foot protest, I have found out the information on that via Instagram, Facebook, Twitter.
Yeah, I completely agree. Social media is a great starting point. However, please don't go on social media and stop there. Go out in the world, volunteer in the community. Shameless plug here. Go vote in your midterm elections. I know so many people don't vote in the midterm elections. Please do.
So, like, I do think social media is the most powerful tool we probably have right now, but it's not necessarily necessary. Like, for example, in my town, at the, like, close by my house, at the Belmore train station, if anybody doesn't know where Belmore is, it's like 15 minutes south of here. Every day, about a month before the election, a bunch of Trump supporters would go and they would do these rallies with their flags and they would blast music at the train station. And I got really frustrated by this. I was a Biden supporter. And so I got really frustrated by this, seeing that there's other voices that weren't being spoken. And this was just a month straight. So about 2.5 weeks before the election, I made a poster and I went and stood by myself at the other end of the train station parking lot. And before I knew it, 2 weeks later, I had about 150 people there who just saw me there, and then other people started joining, and we had Newsday reporters, local representatives. Sometimes just going and doing and being seen in the real world can be just as powerful and make even more of a point.
Yeah, I'm going to point out a tension again between the things that you've said. So the whole first hour of this, I hear echo chamber, emotion, nobody, changes anybody's mind. And now I'm hearing, but it's the best tool we have. And I think what I know about, and Professor Dalton's not here, but I think social media posting does not get out the vote. It's knocking and talking to people door to door. I mean, there's like documented evidence of that it's actually not good to persuade people to vote. So I'm just gonna call your attention to that tension between it's the best, we have to use it, and nobody listens to you who doesn't already agree with you. Because the goal is coalition building, right? That's the question. So if we wanna reach people who don't already agree with us, what do we do? Come back. I love repeat customers.
So this is not necessarily on topic, but I've been doing research into some social media stuff, and this is a conversation that we actually had in our mass media class. And how do you guys feel about government-regulated social media? If the government was to come in and start regulating social media, do you think it's a good idea, or do you think it's a bad idea? What are the pros and cons? Just real quick, just to get your opinion on it.
Okay, so our government is inherently corrupt. If the government starts to regulate, they're going to start pressing minority voices. They're going to start oppressing people that don't agree with the current status quo. That could be very dangerous, because then the voices that need to be heard to invoke real change, even though we kind of agree social media can't invoke real change, it's a good starting point. These topics are not going to be addressed at all, and then the general public is not going to be able to see anything.
So you think the federal government would be less respective of the rights of people than Mark Zuckerberg?
Unfortunately, because profits show that social change can be profitable for Facebook. I think if we elected more progressive politicians, then yeah. But under the current system, with basically neoliberals and traditionalist conservatives always in power, I don't see it happening.
Yeah.
I think that a really good example that we'll probably see in the near future to see what could possibly happen if government overtook and regulated social media is we have our last president is creating his own social media platform. We'll see how that goes because obviously that has to be somewhat similar to what it may look like if the government regulates social media, as he was the last president and now he's creating this platform. So it'll really be an example of what could happen if the government regulates social media, and it'll be interesting to look at.
I just want to add, by the way, the position that a private corporation would do a better job of regulating than the federal government is a neoliberal position. I just want to put that out there. That is the definition of neoliberalism, that private corporations do better than when things are made into public goods. We have somebody who hasn't spoken. I'd love to come up.
Hi, I'm Aisha. I was in your class before.
I know.
So I just have like a few points and questions to ask. So one of them was, how do people choose what is important to care about, what is important to talk about? I am Asian, so the Stop Asian Hate movement was huge for me. But the issues have not been resolved past being acknowledged, and people have stopped talking about it. And then furthermore, what makes someone from a community enough to talk about a topic that they're passionate about? So yes, in terms of race and ethnicity, but I'm a mixed Asian white Muslim woman. Am I quote unquote Asian enough to talk about minority issues? And how can we depend on how others perceive us to gauge how much voice we should have on a topic? And then lastly, furthermore, is American social media the center of everything? Do we take American voices over outside voices when it comes to international conflicts, or Western social media over the center of everything? And like an example would be like Uyghur camps in China. So that's a lot, but.
So pick which one you want, if you had to pick one, because we have 3 minutes
We
left.
can talk about like the American social media centrality.
So are we the center of the world here? Are we assuming that U.S., and I think Annalisa raised that issue, that in fact, people look at our activists and say, you people don't know what you're doing. So do you want to address that, Annalisa? Do you want to come up and talk about it?
Hi again. I was actually thinking about that the whole time. That's a great question. I think that this entire conversation is talking about American activism because international activism isn't so based in social media. Mm-hmm. And of course, I'm only speaking from some knowledge because I was born here, but my family is Dominican, so I do have some international experience. But I think that social media activism is American centered, and I think it also follows American values a lot more. Because
which is why it's so commodified and
exactly,
commercial.
Because it's
and individualistic.
Exactly. And that's an important thing to note, is that a lot of countries are collectivists, and that makes for a more holistic activist, because if you talk to a Latin American activist, they're not going to say, I'm a feminist, I'm an environmentalist. They're just going to say, I'm an activist, because you're talking about issues that affect your family and your country, which in turn is your family. And that means everything. And that's the thing with American activism, is that you can pick and choose. You can choose to be an environmentalist, but not a feminist, or you can choose to not be racist, but you don't care about the environment. And in international activism, you don't get to choose, because if you're choosing to do the right thing, then that is going to translate into a bunch of different aspects of the world, because if activism is intersectional, environmentalism affects racism, affects feminism, and it all affects each other. So I think, to answer your question, it is Americanized, and the very idea that you can pick to be a specific activist is an Americanized ideology, in my opinion.
So you're suggesting that when we think of intersectionality, we don't just focus on, I'm female, working class, Jewish, but intersectionality of issues.
Yeah, exactly. Because also with Hispanic people specifically, there are all different races in Hispanic culture. Like, there are Black Hispanic people, there are white Hispanic people. So racism is also in the cultures itself as well. Like, there's colorism within Latin America as well. But yeah, it's terrible. But it's the same, like, it goes back to the point that, like, this is such a more holistic thing, and social media is only capturing a tiny part. Not to say that tiny part isn't important, it's just not the whole picture.
Okay, so excellent question. So I think that's a good place to end, which is, that we can learn from activists who do it differently because things aren't changing here. And to continue to do the same things because they make us feel good, I think we're all in agreement, is not going to change anything if it hasn't already. And so we need to start thinking about new models, ways of engaging people who don't already agree with us, ways of building coalitions and dealing with the audiences we have, not the audiences we want, and using models from other places and being what we call transnational, so that our activism isn't bound within a national border and conforming to national culture and standards, but that we think about, because these problems are global. So I thank both of you for introducing that, and thank you for your brilliant comments. Thank you for coming. And I'll just tell you what I tell my students all the time. When you get a chance to take a microphone and make your ideas known, take it.